The Miami Hurricanes surprisingly didn't land a top 10 recruiting class in the last cycle. So let's talk about the roadmap for getting back into that top 10 or even top 5 for the class of 2026.
You are Locked On Canes, your daily podcast on the Miami Hurricanes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I am Alex Donno, University of Miami alumnus, co-host of Locked On ACC, and writer for Canes County at Rivals. And thank you so much to the everydayers for making Locked On Canes your first listen and your first watch today. We're available free wherever you get your podcasts. We're free on YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On this loaded episode, we'll talk about Miami Hurricanes coaches, especially new coaches on the recruiting trail, the type of recruiting impact that Zach Etheridge and Damian Lewis and Corey Heatherman can have and are having already on the trail because they've already been hard at work. We'll scout the top Miami Hurricanes recruiting prospects, the type of players you're going to need to get into that top 10. So in the last cycle, 2025, Miami surprisingly didn't have a top 10 class. According to the 24/7 Sports Composite, Miami had the 13th rated class in the country. Now, for the class of 2026 coming up, it's way too early to draw any conclusions. Miami only has 3 prospects verbally committed, and their recruiting class ranked 30th at the moment. Now, only 3 prospects committed. All the teams that are currently rated top 10 for 2026 have at least 6 verbal commits, with Oregon that currently has the number 1 class. They have 10 verbal commits already. So Miami has a lot more spots open, a lot more work to do, a lot of time left on the clock. And we want to bring in a very good friend of ours. We call him the recruiting overlord, and he is the host of the new Portal podcast, which talks recruiting and NIL, one of my favorite shows already on the Locked On Podcast Network. Brian Smith is with us. So Brian, again, Miami didn't have a top 10 recruiting class of 2025. Do you think they're going to climb back up into that top 10 for 2026?
Yeah, I think it'll be pretty easy for them to do so. Miami had such a great year. They've proven themselves as a program that's going to be in the mix for the playoff. That makes selling your program so much easier. And we all know that the staff does a good job on the recruiting trail, led by the leader himself, Mario Cristobal. Not many people are going to work like he does. I expect them in a year coming off where they lost out on a couple of kids down to the wire. The way things swing, they'll probably win a few more of those. They'll be in the top 10 this next year.
Well, and another thing that I think we need to put more value in, like as a collective, Miami unit, is the power that comes from seeing players get drafted. Now, in recent years, I would say Miami has not had enough players drafted to the NFL based on, 4 and 5 star prospects coming in and not panning out the way that they should. I look at the NFL draft as a couple of months away. Not only is Miami about to have, a top 3 pick, maybe the number 1 overall pick in Cam Ward, but Miami's got 10 guys who were invited to the scouting combine, which means they could have 10 players drafted in a couple of months, Brian. And I'm sure that's going to speak for itself when you're still recruiting this class of 2026. If you get 10 guys into the NFL draft, that can help as well.
I don't see how it wouldn't. That's one of the things that recruits always tell myself or Wilt Fong or Garcia or anybody else in the industry. Are they developing players and helping them get drafted? That's a checkbox. And it's not like you can lie about it. Anybody can search that in about 3 seconds. So if you're doing that, it's going to help the cause. And I know they're going to use that as a recruiting tool as well. So that, and I cannot stress this enough. You know how the NFL does a great job with marketing. They're going to use Cam. He's a very charismatic personality to push the NFL draft day, to sell advertising on. He's going to be on every billboard. He's going to be talked about as a possible top 3 pick all the way up to the day of the draft. And maybe he will be the first pick. Who knows? That will also propel the Miami football recruiting machine.
Well, speaking of Cam Ward, he was at the Dallas Mavericks game last night. First of all, I take so much pride. He gets on that Jumbotron, and, for those who are watching the YouTube version, you see these photos. I'll describe this to the audio listeners. Cam Ward gets on the Jumbotron there at American Airlines Center in Dallas. He's throwing the U up, which is awesome. And then after the game, Steph Curry literally gives Cam Ward the jersey off of his back. Steph gives Cam autographs, personalizes his jersey, and gives it to Cam Ward. So I thought that was really cool last night to see Ward, who, of course, he's from Texas, and he's been doing his pre-draft training in the Dallas area. He's actually been training at the SMU facility. He shows up to the Mavericks game. So that's great publicity for the University of Miami, certainly. But let's dive into this class of 2026, Brian. Are there any guys, if Miami's going to get a top 10 or maybe even top 5 class, that might be where their ambitions are. 2 cycles ago, they had a top 5 class, so it can be done. Anybody you look at as must get recruits, right? We've had names thrown out to us like Derek Cooper of Chaminade, who just got his 5th star from ESPN. Calvin Russell, a big-time local receiver who's very sought after. Are some of these guys must-gets if Miami's going to get into that top 10 or top 5?
I hate using must-get because Miami uses such a wide net to recruit. They don't miss much, but those would be a couple of the key guys I would start with. Maybe Javari Flowers you could throw in there.
Yeah.
There's a few others, but Pepe, the offensive tackle from IMG, would certainly be a possibility. Getting elite tackles, they hold more water because of how important they were looking at the college football playoff, the NFL. Like, ask a certain quarterback in Kansas City how important O-lines are after the way the Eagles beat the crap out of them. So maybe Pepe. But beyond that, I mean, they're just in on so many guys. I wouldn't put it that way. I would look at it from a balanced perspective. Any elite DB they can get, because that's still Miami's biggest weakness, I would go that way. So if I was going to just pick one, I'd probably go Flowers.
Yeah. And for Flowers, I know he's going to have a whirlwind in the month of March, taking official visits. I expect him to make a Miami OV. I haven't seen a publicized date about that yet, when that's going to happen. But, Miami's a school that was before he reclassified, Brian, because he reclassified from 2026 to 2025. So he's going to be a guy coming in this cycle. Before he reclassified, Miami was getting some, predictions, some crystal balls for him. I don't know how much his reclassification has changed that. But do you think Miami is still trending pretty well for Javari Flowers? And I know Georgia's been making a push. Who else is in the mix there?
Well, that's the big question. Like, one of the advantages that Miami and them have, Oregon was the school that he grew up rooting for. They just had arguably the best DB class in the country. I don't know if he wants to go there. Following that, it could be harder to play.
Right.
Florida State, that's the one position they're pretty good at is DB, but they've got 2 guys with South Florida ties. So don't forget about the Noles. I still think that Miami, I would assume, is the most likely landing spot for him, but they need it's an easy sell. They need defensive backs. Like, he has a chance to play next year if he goes there. So I still consider him 26. I know he reclassed, but that's just not the way my mind works. Anyway, it's weird for a guy to reclass in January, but that's what he did. Anyway, I'm curious to see what happens with that, because his recruitment's going to go throughout the spring. I don't know if he's got a different window on how the visits work, because he's still the 25 class. I don't even know how it works. His recruitment is kind of like low on the radar right now. Nobody really knows, from what I've heard, like, where he's going. And maybe he just needs to take a few trips to be sure, which is fine. But if I had to pick, I'd guess Miami.
Yeah, I think he's got to, since he reclassified, I think he's got to decide by April 1st, because that's when the late signing window closes. So, yeah, he's got, and, basically it's going to be March, because we're in a dead period now. So he's going to have March to make whatever visits he wants to take and then make his decision. But that one, it's funny. If Miami does land Javari Flowers, I think I've run this through the calculator. I don't think that would quite get Miami into the top 10 for 2020. It would get them a little closer. It would move them up from like 13th to 11th, maybe. So they would almost be in the top 10 for the current cycle. But we have a lot we want to get to with Brian Smith. I want to take a deeper dive, not only on Derek Cooper, who just received his 5th star, the stud running back, safety out of Chaminade, but Jasen Lopez from Chaminade, who could be the next Xavier Restrepo. This is someone that Miami has really been turning up the heat for. I want to talk about Somourian Wingo, who's got an official visit to Miami set for May 30th. Would like to talk about Ayden Pouncey, who's also got a Miami OV set. Got a ton of prospects to get to. You want to keep it locked right here. We're only getting started on this brand new episode of Locked On Canes. FanDuel is changing the game. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. There's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature, I should say, because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for the late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com to shoot your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you for making this episode of Locked On Canes your first listen and your first watch today. For your next listen, make sure you check out Locked On ACC. Kenton Gibbs and I host that show, taking you around all the big storylines of the Atlantic Coast Conference. We had a great conversation with attorney Doug Rohan of Rohan Law about all the legal disputes, all the stuff that Brian Smith loves talking about, the legal disputes with Florida State, Clemson, UNC, maybe trying to leave the ACC for the SEC. So we had you covered on Locked On ACC. The stuff that I actually know Brian Smith loves talking about, the recruiting overlord, is with us here. Let's talk about Jasen Lopez, who is a dual sport stud at Chaminade. Tremendous basketball player, tremendous football receiver. He reminds a lot of people of Xavier Restrepo, and there's been this sense out there that over the past couple of weeks, Miami has really been turning up the heat for Lopez. What does he bring to the table, and anyone Miami might have to watch out for when it comes to landing Lopez?
Well, he's a Miami fan, so that helps. He goes to Chaminade, so to get to a game, he goes about 20 minutes. So it's not very difficult in that regard. As for him as a player, I met him last year at Miami Under Armour. His wide receiver coach from Chaminade, George, was there, and he's like, "This is a kid you need to watch." I'm like, "Okay." He didn't look very big, wasn't all that like physically impressive. I'm like, "All right, we'll see." And then, of course, South Florida is loaded with receivers every year. And I'm like, "Who's that guy? Who's that guy?" And it was Lopez. He is an incredible route runner, and he changes direction really well. But the best way to evaluate him is not football. Watch him play basketball. He is an elite basketball player, too. He's got Division I offers and plans to play both sports at the collegiate level. Like, he can throw it around and make guys look bad with passing. That's probably what he's best at. His vision is tremendous. But he can also stroke it from deep, and he can get into the paint and finish around big guys. Like, he is just acrobatic. And that's where his comparison that you brought up to a certain guy that just left the U, one of my favorite receivers in college football, is absolutely on the money. Look, Restrepo was one of the most hardworking guys you're going to see. Lopez's personality, the way he carries himself, the way he trains, fits that to a T. And he's probably even shiftier, maybe not quite as strong. There's one thing that Strep had going for him. He didn't miss any weight training days. You can tell by the way he was built. He just needs to add a little weight, but he's a really good player. Miami's probably the team to watch, but I think his recruitment is so underrated. Like, he was the #1 guy for Chaminade, and he's still like just a low three. It's bizarre. Here are his numbers: 87 catches, 1,300 yards, 14.9, and 14 scores. He's playing at Chaminade. He's not playing against chumps.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Those are Jeremiah Smith kind of numbers. It's crazy. But if you look at it another way, people want measurables, and he's only like 5'10", 5'11", but he's a slot receiver. He's not playing Jeremiah's spot at the boundary. He's a slot. So, yeah, great kid. He's very intelligent, and he works hard. Miami probably hopes he stays lower ranked and somebody else doesn't come in, but I think he could play at Georgia or anywhere.
That's a great call. So and when it comes to receiver recruiting, and you mentioned a lot of positions, Miami casts a wide net. It's not all South Florida prospects. There's a North Florida prospect that Miami is interested in. It's Somourian Wingo out of he's from St. Augustine, 6'2", 175. So he's taller when it comes to those measurables, being St. Augustine right near Jacksonville. Of course, Florida is also in the mix for Wingo. Wingo is locked in a May 30th official visit to Miami, and there's other good players that are going to be visiting on that May 30th weekend. What can you tell our listeners about Wingo you've had a chance to scout him before.
Yeah, I've seen him play. He's a very athletic kid, and his tape doesn't lie. Up where he plays, not many kids are going to guard him. Not that many could anywhere, but like on the 7-on-7 circuit, he's good. He's a guy that just makes plays, changes directions well, and he's built like a track athlete. He fits the mold of what you expect, like early 90s Miami receivers. That's how I would look at him. Very, very explosive too. He's got a lot of upside because he's not filled out. He's not a guy that's like done growing. I think he'll be 190 some pounds, 200 pounds when he's done filling out. And he just gets the ball, man. Whether you want to move him in the middle of the field and work that, he's got some savvy to him, and he can get deep. Florida's the team to watch. Family likes Florida. He's pretty close to there. UF will be the team to beat. Miami's probably second right now.
So another player whose family surely likes Florida, who's going to be visiting that same weekend, May 30th, is Ayden Pouncey. He is related to the Pouncey twins. I think was he a younger cousin of
that
the
family
Pounceys?
Is insane. Well, I guess
insane, right? So he's also visiting that May 30th weekend. I mean, does Miami have a legitimate shot there, or is this just one of those where it's like you have to shoot your shot, right? Like you have to try, or do you think Miami could legitimately beat out Florida for Ayden Pouncey?
It's ironic that you bring that up because I was talking to Brandon Olson of Locked On Gators the other day, and I'm going to post a show tomorrow. He is quote unquote not bullish on where Florida stands in recruiting, and he's very concerned about how they're approaching it from the administration, et cetera, because from what he's hearing, and to me, to a little bit too, but I mean, Brandon's very Florida-centric.
Yeah.
There's so much concerned about Billy still getting canned, it's really hurting recruiting.
Wow.
So it's twofold here. Pouncey's a great example. Should be easy. He's a Gator legacy, and in a lot of ways, he's a kid they've coveted. Great kid. He would fit in anywhere. What happens if they start slow? What happens if Miami trounces them early in the year? I think there is no other program in the country that needs to win a big game early this next season more than the Gators. I mean, last year, that game they had in the swamp against Miami, that was one of the most poorly coached-looking teams I have ever seen. I mean, Miami's good, but like they just handed them the game before it even got started. So if they don't start fast, any kids they get right now, even Olson's like, and he's as big a Gator fan as you're going to meet.
Sure. Yeah.
I when he was that negative, I'm like, okay, there's something brewing here. They've only got 3 commitments right now. They're about to lose one. Everybody thinks Waters is going to flip to Miami. I wouldn't be surprised if Pouncey ended up with Miami or some others too. Florida needs to way exceed expectations, and their schedule is ridiculous again this year. Like the scheduling gods were not very friendly to them, but they got to win something early. Because what I'm hearing, I'm not sure they're going to go all in on the NIL. We'll see how that goes. But to finish, and even if they do, kids aren't going to go somewhere if they don't know the staff. Everybody likes Billy and all that, but you got to win. You know, it's nice to like him, but if he's unemployed, what's the point? So Miami, whether they win them now is not the important thing. Let's talk in late October, early November. I would not be surprised if Miami flips some kids. Pouncey could be one of those. But sure, I would pick Pouncey right now to go to UF. Let's not hold that for the long term, though. There's a lot to be determined.
A lot to unpack from what Brian just said, including you brought up Jalen Seatbelt Waters, defensive back. Yep. So you still, and we've talked about him before a couple weeks ago here on Locked On Canes. You still feel that Miami's got the momentum to flip him.
That's from talking to multiple people. Yeah. Now, recruiting that can change in a heartbeat, but that's what I've heard. So
Well, now that we're on the theme of taking players from other teams' backyards or verbal commits, I don't know if there's something to this. You're the right person to ask about this one because you're in Auburn, Alabama right now. And, one of Auburn's verbal commits is 4-star linebacker Jamichael Garrett, who is from Auburn. So that would seem like a really tough one for Miami to flip from Auburn. But Miami apparently is trying and turning up the heat. What can you tell us about Jamichael Garrett and his recruitment?
Really fast linebacker. He played the last couple of seasons down at Gulf Shores before moving to Auburn to play with his old coach. Great kid, a lot of fun to be around, and he fits the old school Miami backside linebacker that just ran down everything. So from a schematic standpoint, he would play Wesley's spot, and he fits it. They're very similar players. As far as recruiting goes, I talked to him the other, 2 weeks ago, Oregon, Miami, and a handful of other schools are really coming after him. And then right after I spoke to him, Miami's where he visited. I'm sure some of you saw that on social media. He posted the thing with Mario. I don't know what's the deal is because he lives in Auburn now.
Yeah.
He moved there to go to the high school. I mean, like from the high school to the stadium where Auburn plays, to college, maybe 10 minutes. So it'd be weird, but why is he still taking visits if he's not considering it? To the point of Florida, it's the same thing around here. Everybody knows that you freezing that staff. They want them to win, but like this is year 3. They sucked last year. I cover them. They sucked. They couldn't win close games. They found ways to lose. There's not a lot of options. Everybody's like, okay, you got to prove it to me now. And I'm thinking a lot of the recruits are too. Auburn's recruiting right now is through the roof.
Yeah.
Will that stick? This is another program in the same boat as UF. Is he going to be there? Do we know it? So I think that Miami is making a calculated look ahead. They wanted him anyway, and they recruited the Mobile area where Gulf Shores was, so that's how they got involved. But now he's at Auburn. They're just going to keep recruiting him. They're playing with house money here. So, yeah, he's a really good player, though, and if he flipped, it would not surprise me. Watch Auburn season. They open at Baylor, by the way. If they lose that game, all bets are off for the Auburn Tigers.
Going over to the offensive line, which, of course, is the Cristobal Mirabal specialty. Miami recently received a Steve Wiltfong prediction to land offensive lineman Ben Congdon out of Ohio, an area I don't know if this is out in the middle of nowhere or something. Zor, Ohio. He's from Tuscarawas Valley in Ohio, but it looks like a big time, 6'7", 270-pound offensive tackle. You up on the recruitment of Congdon?
The school to watch beyond Miami is Penn State. They've been getting in on him. Their Troutwine's a pretty good recruiter for an offensive line coach. Most offensive line coaches aren't very good recruiters, but so is Mirabal. Mirabal is actually good at it, and he likes it. So this will be very interesting. I don't think Ohio State is all, which kind of surprises me. They need offensive line. Ohio State's going through change. We'll see how that goes. Always watch out for the Buckeyes if they go after an in-state kid. I get it. Penn State or Miami right now is the way that's kind of like. We'll see how it goes. But Miami's probably going to get an OB. Penn State's probably going to get one. I don't even know who else will.
Well, I want to ask Brian about Miami's new coaches and what they can do on the trail. Because, again, I love the new defensive line coach hire. And just so people know, Jason Taylor is still at Miami, because every time I talk about Damione Lewis, I get these comments like, wait, what happened to Jason Taylor? They're working together, right? Damione Lewis is going to coach the defensive tackles. Jason Taylor's coaching the defensive ends. But how dynamic can they be together on the recruiting trail? You want to keep it locked right here. We're not done yet on this brand new episode of Locked On Canes. Thank you for making Locked On Canes your first listen. For your next listen, check out the Portal podcast. You guys, if you're enjoying this episode right now because you like talking recruiting, you're really going to enjoy the Portal podcast. Brian Smith hosts that, and we focus on Miami recruiting here on Locked On Canes. Brian will take you through all of that at the national level, so you get the full context of what's going on around the country. And Brian, Miami's made multiple additions to their defensive coaching staff within the past few weeks. Corey Heatherman is the new defensive coordinator. He'll probably also serve as the linebackers coach. Zach Etheridge as the new defensive backs coach, who's probably going to focus on the cornerbacks. I think Miami's still looking for a safeties coach, so we'll see what happens there. And Damione Lewis, former Miami standout player in the 90s up to 2000. He was part of, one of the better teams in college football that should have played for the national championship that year. He's coached the defensive line of the Seattle Seahawks for 4 years, recently coached at Colorado under Deion Sanders. Their defensive line performed very well this past season. He's now at Miami. But what about Damione Lewis as the recruiter, and how good of a tandem can he and Jason Taylor be together?
As recruiters, that's pretty unique. Deion wouldn't have hired him if he didn't have personality. We both know Deion's not going to mess around with that. For those that don't know, Damione was out of East Texas. I believe it was Sulphur Springs. I can't remember which high school it was, but he was a national recruit himself back in the day. I remember his recruitment. That was who Butch wanted. That was like his guy, and they got him. It was a big recruitment.
By the way, you hit it right on the head. Sulphur Springs High School in Sulphur Springs, Texas.
Yeah, it's one of those famous East Texas towns where there ain't a lot to do. Friday night, if you've got a business, you might as well close down and go to the game because that's what everybody else is doing. So, and he was a national recruit. Miami got him. He played right away. But this is the kind of hire that I think Miami needs to consistently do, and they've done a good job with it. People that have ties to South Florida, people in his case actually played for the U, and he knows D-line. I mean, he's a guy that made it to the NFL. He's a guy that's coaching the NFL. That will resonate and sell with high school football recruits. It's a great hire. There's no doubt about it. It's a great hire.
Yeah. And, Zach Etheridge, him on the recruiting, he's someone you're familiar with. He had worked at Auburn, a couple years prior to coming to Miami. I mean, this is someone else who should be able to make an impact on the trail for the K. And because he specializes in that area, like Alabama and Georgia, he recruits really well.
You got to remember, Mario worked under a certain guy by the name of Nick Saban in Tuscaloosa. So he knows that area and how important it is. For whatever the reason, Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi produce big-bodied linemen, O&D. That's why he recruits it so heavily. Mobile, Birmingham, the whole 9 yards. This guy knows the area. And as a bonus, he coached at Houston, too. As far as the city goes, Houston's top 5 in the country many years in terms of NFL talent. The connections are great. He has a lot of ties to Georgia kids that Miami wants. This is a good hire in that regard. And Miami's just continuing to keep the pipeline to the major SEC areas at home. They're going to do well with that. Watch for some new names to pop up because he's on the staff.
I like it. What do you have going on the rest of the week, Brian, on the Portal podcast, which is it might be the newest show on the Locked On Network. I think it's already one of the best. What can fans expect there?
Well, I'm going to be I've had a ton of shows with different people like yourself, Brandon Olson and Stephen Willis from Locked On Ole Miss. Had John Garcia Jr. from Rivals yesterday talking about the Under Armour Atlanta kids. But we're going to start breaking down a lot of the under-the-radar kids, several in South Florida because I just like South Florida recruiting. Got a lot of shorts from videos from Under Armour events, 7-on-7 and stuff like that. There's just a ton of different stuff going on. If you want to find it, it's still new, so Google and everything hasn't recognized it as much as I like, but just search Locked On the Portal. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Podbean, wherever you get your pods. And again, recruiting, NIL, and the transfer portal. When we get to spring, by the way, we got another spring window with 10 days open up that you and I will be discussing Miami, I'm sure, about the portal. And that's one of the reasons we named it the portal. The transfer portal is 100% a part of it. So anything roster management, that's what I'm talking about. And I post 7 days a week. It is a show 7 days a week.
And so people are ready for that spring window. I think Miami's going to be looking at least one more wide receiver. I think Miami's going to be looking at another defensive lineman, likely, and probably another linebacker. So it's going to be another busy spring portal period for Miami. And of course, when it comes to finding a receiver, you'd think having Carson Beck now, who you didn't have him for most of the winter portal, but having Carson Beck now is going to help you become more attractive. So huge thank you and shout out to Brian Smith. Make sure you follow our show, hit the like button, subscribe, Locked On Canes. Make sure you find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. So we'll talk to you next time on another episode of Locked On Canes. We're part of the awesome Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.